Part 1, Aunt Lavinia, Sterling House, Monday, April 1, 1912, the early April sun lay softly over the gardens of Aunt Lavinia's manor, turning the damp morning grass to threads of pale gold. Spring in the English countryside was still tentative, as though the season itself were politely asking permission to arrive. Here and there crocuses pushed bravely through the soil, and the bare branches of the apple trees rattled faintly in the cool breeze drifting over the rolling fields beyond the stone walls. At the far end of the lawn, however, the season, and indeed the entire civilized world, had been thoroughly conquered. Edward Alexander Florent, known to nearly everyone as Teddy, stood poised atop a small rise of earth near the old stone wall, boots planted wide in what he believed to be a most commanding stance. In his right hand he brandished a wooden sword of his own careful choosing but formerly a part of a broken crate in the carriage house, and his expression bore the grave determination of a boy engaged in matters of the highest importance. Before him stretched the uncharted territories. To an ordinary observer, they consisted chiefly of Aunt Lavinia's somewhat overgrown shrubbery, a damp sweep of lawn, and the unfortunate remains of last autumn's flower beds. But to Teddy's keen and well-read mind, the region swarmed with peril. He narrowed his eyes. "Yes! I thought as much," he murmured, in the low, steady tone he had heard Andrew use when discussing cricket strategy. There, just beyond the hydrangea bush, movement! With a sharp intake of breath, Teddy sprang forward, sword raised. "Stand fast, vile creature!" he cried, voice ringing bravely across the quiet garden. "You shall not pass whilst I remain!" The hydrangea, being entirely innocent of villainy, did not respond. Teddy took this as confirmation of its deeply suspicious nature. With considerable vigor, he engaged the enemy. There followed a brief but decisive battle, during which several twigs were vanquished, one damp leaf was most thoroughly subdued, and Teddy himself executed what he felt was a particularly fine sideways maneuver he had recently invented. At last he stepped back, breathing hard but triumphant. "Ha!" he said, with quiet satisfaction, "I suspected as much!" He lowered his sword only slightly, however. One could never be too careful, according to Mr. Jules Verne, and Teddy considered Mr. Verne a thoroughly reliable authority. Dangers in unexplored regions were rarely solitary. Sure enough! From the direction of the old rose arbor came a faint and unmistakably distressed sound. Teddy froze. Someone was in peril. His heart gave a quick, earnest thump. In an instant his posture changed, not merely a conqueror now, but a rescuer, a gentleman adventurer of the very highest order. He hurried across the lawn, boots darkening with damp, weaving between the still sleepy garden beds until the arbor came into view. "There is no cause for alarm!" he called ahead in his clearest heroic voice. "I am come!" He burst through the trailing, thorny branches, and very nearly collided with Aunt Lavinia's exceedingly patient Persian cat, which sat upon the gravel path regarding him with an expression of deep and ancient disapproval. Teddy stopped short, the cat blinked slowly. For a moment, the great rescue faltered, then Teddy straightened at once, recovering with admirable dignity. "Ah!" he said gravely, lowering his sword and giving the cat a small, respectful bow. "You are safe, I have arrived in time." The cat continued to look unconvinced. A cool breeze stirred the branches overhead. Teddy finished his careful inspection of the rose arbor and, finding no further immediate dangers, allowed himself a moment's rest. Just beyond the gravel path stood an old wooden bench, its green paint worn pale in places by many English winters. He climbed onto it with a small, satisfied huff and settled properly, sword laid across his knees in case of sudden emergencies. For a little while he simply sat. The garden was very quiet. Above him the sky stretched wide and pale, the sort of soft English blue that looked almost washed clean. A thin cloud drifted slowly past, and Teddy followed it with thoughtful eyes. After a moment, his expression changed. The brave explorer softened back into a small boy. "Mama would have liked this garden." The thought came gently, the way it often did when things were very still. It had been 2 years now, since 1910, which felt to Teddy both like a terribly long time and hardly any time at all. Sometimes he worried he was beginning to forget the exact sound of her voice. That was the worst part. He lifted his chin toward the sky, very seriously, very carefully. Teddy pressed his fingers to his lips and blew 3 small kisses upward into the cool April air. 1, 2, 3, they floated away invisibly, which was exactly as intended. "There," he murmured softly, "so you know where I am." The breeze moved faintly across the garden, stirring the crocuses. Today he was quite alone. Papa and the others had gone off somewhere with the Sterlings, Aunt Lavinia's in-laws, who had come to call with their 4 grown children for some days. Teddy knew them only a little, but they were all terribly old and spoke mostly of dull things. Since they were Jonathan and Clara and Andrew's sort of people, Teddy had once again been gently left behind. He did not mind, well, not very much. Still, the garden felt rather large, and Aunt Lavinia, Teddy's small shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly. He was not exactly afraid of Aunt Lavinia, not exactly, but she did have a way of looking at him rather closely, and she was forever trying to kiss him. Teddy frowned faintly. She always smelled the same, too, a very sweet, heavy sort of scent that clung in the air even after she moved away. It was not unpleasant, precisely, only rather a lot. Still, she was kind in her way, and she gave him sweets, which was their secret. Teddy swung his boots gently above the gravel, considering this complicated balance of affairs, when "Teddy, dear!" He jumped slightly. Aunt Lavinia's voice floated from the direction of the house, warm and lilting and impossible to ignore. "Time for tea!" Teddy straightened at once, scooping up his wooden sword out of long habit. "Yes, Aunt Lavinia!" he called back, in his best well-brought-up voice. He slid down from the bench, casting one last quick glance up at the pale spring sky, just in case the kisses were still on there, and then turned obediently toward the manor house. Adventure, for the moment, would have to wait. The drawing room was already warm when Teddy was shown in. A coal fire murmured softly in the grate, and the tall windows, half draped in lace, turned the pale afternoon light to something honey soft and dim. Aunt Lavinia always kept her rooms a little too warm, Teddy thought. The air carried that same thick, sugary perfume that seemed to belong entirely to her, violets, perhaps, or something even sweeter, and it hung gently over the polished furniture and delicate china like an invisible curtain. Aunt Lavinia herself sat poised at the tea table, very elegant in a gown of soft mauve, her dark hair arranged in careful waves that did not appear to move even when she did. "There you are, darling boy," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "Come and sit by me." Teddy approached dutifully. He did not rush. One never rushed toward Aunt Lavinia if it could be helped. Still, he climbed neatly into the chair beside her and folded his hands in what he believed was a very proper manner. His wooden sword he had, with some foresight, left just outside the door. "Were you having adventures again?" Lavinia asked, smiling in that close, watchful way she had. "Yes, Aunt," Teddy said, "there were several extremely serious dangers in the lower garden, I have no doubt," she murmured. The tea things were laid beautifully, thin slices of bread and butter, small ice cakes, and, most promising of all, a dish of shining sugar sweets placed just slightly to Teddy's side of the table. Their secret! Lavinia poured the tea with slow, graceful movements. When she leaned nearer, the sweet scent around her deepened, wrapping warmly, and a little overwhelmingly, around Teddy's nose. He sat very still. "Well," she said lightly, handing him his cup, "you must be quite excited." Teddy looked up. "For what, Aunt?" Her smile curved just a little more. "For our grand voyage, of course, the Titanic. Such a magnificent ship!" She watched him closely. "And going home again afterward. You must be looking forward to it." Teddy's fingers tightened slightly around his teacup. He nodded, because that was the proper thing. "Yes, Aunt," and it was true, mostly. The word Titanic had been floating through the grown-ups' conversations for weeks now, always spoken with that particular tone adults used when something was meant to be very important indeed. Andrew said it was the largest ship ever built. Jonathan had read aloud figures from the newspaper. Papa seemed quietly pleased about the whole affair. Teddy did think it sounded splendid, but ships also meant long stretches of nothing much to do, and crowds, and being the youngest, "I think," Teddy said carefully, "it will be very grand." "I am certain it will," Lavinia replied. Her hand came up, too quickly for Teddy to dodge politely, and she pressed a soft, perfumed kiss to his temple. "There's my brave boy!" Teddy sat very straight. Across the room, the fire gave a small settling sigh. Lavinia selected one of the sugar sweets and, with a conspiratorial little smile, slipped it onto Teddy's plate. "For later," she said softly. "Their secret." Teddy's face brightened despite himself. "Thank you, Aunt Lavinia. Well," she continued, stirring her tea, "you shall have quite the company aboard. Your dear father, of course. And Jonathan. And Andrew. And Clara." She ticked them off gently. "And the Kilmartins will be with us the whole voyage. The Earl and Countess, and all the children, Lawrence, Eloise, Edmund, and little Kitty." At that, Teddy's expression changed, just a little. He liked Kitty. She was not at all like the others. The memory rose at once, the half-open door down the corridor 2 days ago. Kitty standing quite boldly in her room, in trousers. Proper trousers. Teddy had been so astonished he had nearly dropped his book. He had not told a soul. Kitty was different in other ways too. She did not speak down to him. And yesterday she had spent nearly 20 minutes helping him coax a gardener's nervous terrier out from under the hedge. She understood animals. That counted for a great deal. Yes, Aunt, Teddy said, trying to sound properly neutral. Kitty is very nice. Lavinia's eyes flickered with mild amusement. Is she indeed? Teddy reached quickly for his teacup, for the smallest moment, and Lavinia did not answer. It was not anything obvious. She was still smiling, she always smiled, and her hand continued its slow, delicate stirring of the tea, but something in her eyes changed, just briefly, like the flicker of a shadow passing over water. Well, she said at last, very smoothly, Kitty is certainly unusual. The word sat oddly in the warm room. Teddy felt it at once. He was not quite sure why, or how, but he knew. Aunt Lavinia did not like Kitty, not in the ordinary way grown-ups sometimes didn't like one another. It was quieter than that, sharper. Like the way the gardener sometimes looked at the fox tracks near the hen house. Teddy's fingers curled slightly against his saucer. Lavinia's gaze rested on him a moment too long, thoughtful, measuring, and then she leaned nearer and gave him one of her close, sweet smiles. You must be careful about the company you keep, darling, she said lightly. Her fingers came up and smoothed an invisible crease from his sleeve. The perfume was very strong this close. Teddy swallowed. Yes, Aunt Lavinia. He did not promise anything more. Across the table, the dish of sweets gleamed quietly. After a moment, Lavinia sat back again, the strange flicker gone as if it had never been. She lifted her teacup with perfect composure. I dare say, she continued pleasantly, the voyage will sort everyone into their proper places soon enough. Teddy did not entirely understand what that meant, but the words made a small, cool feeling settle in his stomach. Outside, the pale English afternoon drifted quietly onward. Far away, though none of them yet knew it, the great ship that would carry them all was already preparing to meet the sea, and Teddy Florent, small and careful in his chair beside Aunt Lavinia, sat very straight indeed, with one secret sweet on his plate in the wide, uncertain world slowly drawing nearer. Part 2, the dinner at Sterling House. Upstairs, Aunt Lavinia's bathroom was already prepared. Steam curled gently along the high tiled walls, and the great porcelain bathtub, Aunt Lavinia's pride, stood gleaming on its clawed feet like something out of a proper grand hotel. The water was deep and pleasantly warm, with just the faintest scent of lavender soap floating in the air. Teddy slipped carefully into the bath. For approximately 3 seconds, he behaved exactly as a well-brought-up boy was meant to. Then the sea voyage began. The bathroom vanished. In its place rose the rolling, treacherous waters of the Southern Ocean, lashed by invisible winds and populated, as Teddy knew from very reliable sources, by creatures of the most appalling description. Teddy narrowed his eyes. There, movement beneath the surface. With great seriousness, he seized the bath sponge and raised it high. You shall not take this vessel whilst I command it, he declared in a fierce whisper. The water sloshed dangerously. The creature attacked. Teddy lunged. There followed a most valiant struggle involving several impressive splashes, a strategic knee maneuver, and one extremely daring sideways turn that sent a small wave over the rim of the tub. At last, breathless, cheeks flushed pink, Teddy rose carefully to his knees in the bath and delivered the final, decisive blow. Ha! He gasped. Victory! The sea monster was thoroughly defeated. He was just straightening to assume what he felt was a particularly heroic posture when, the door opened. Teddy, darling, he froze. In one swift, mortified movement, Teddy dropped straight back down into the water until only his head remained above the surface. Aunt Lavinia stood in the doorway. For one dreadful moment, Teddy was certain she must have seen him playing in the water, but Lavinia merely smiled that soft, close smile of hers and crossed the tiled floor with slow, unhurried steps. The warm, heavy sweetness of her perfume followed her like a trailing ribbon. Well, she murmured, someone has been very industrious. Teddy's ears burned. Yes, Aunt Lavinia. She did not tease him, which was somehow worse. Instead, she moved to the side of the tub and, without fuss, dipped her elegant fingers into the water. Come here, darling, we must make you properly presentable before dinner. Teddy obeyed at once. He always did. Lavinia's hands were gentle but very thorough as she worked the lavender soap carefully through his hair. Her touch was light, practiced, almost soothing, though Teddy sat very still all the same, shoulders slightly drawn in. "And your ears," she said softly. She always watched his ears. Teddy endured this with great fortitude. When at last she was satisfied, she rose smoothly. There now, quite the young gentleman again. A short time later, clean and pink-cheeked, Teddy stood in the nursery bedroom fastening the last careful button of his finest sailor suit. The white one, the very best! The crisp white fabric sat neatly across his small shoulders, the blue striped collar lying just so. The silk tie, after one brief and private struggle, was arranged properly at his throat. He smoothed the front of the blouse with both hands. Very smart, very proper, very nearly as fine, he thought, as an officer preparing to board a great ocean liner. From downstairs came the faint sounds of the house stirring in preparation for dinner, distant footsteps, the soft clink of china, the low murmur of adult voices beginning to return. The others would be home by now, soon everything would begin to move forward. Teddy gave one last serious look at his reflection, then, squaring his small shoulders with quiet determination, Edward Alexander Florent turned and went to face the evening. After the dressing gong sounded, Teddy was on the back terrace with Pip. Pip, who was, in Teddy's private and entirely correct opinion, one of the finest dogs ever produced, bounded across the flagstones in a blur of mottled fur and bright intelligence. The young Australian Shepherd mix had already decided that Teddy was a person of excellent judgment and therefore worth his full attention. "Stand by, Pip," Teddy whispered urgently, crouching low. "Enemy movement at the rose hedge." Pip responded with wild enthusiasm, skidding slightly on the damp stone and issuing a soft, excited bark, and was immediately shushed. "Pip!" came Kitty's voice from the steps, amused but gentle. "You mustn't knock Mr. Florent over before dinner." Teddy straightened at once, very properly, though his cheeks were pink with happy exertion. Kitty descended the steps, her expression warm in that quiet, sideways way Teddy liked. She wore a simple dinner dress of pale blue that made her look softer than usual, though there was still something about her, something slightly untidy and independent, that never quite matched the other young ladies Teddy had met. Pip, traitorously, abandoned all military discipline and galloped to her at once. "He likes you," Kitty said. "I like him very much," Teddy replied earnestly. Kitty smiled, properly this time. "Well, that makes you sensible." From inside, the main gong sounded, low and commanding. Teddy jumped slightly. "That's us," Kitty said. Pip gave one last hopeful wag before being firmly directed toward the servants' corridor. Teddy brushed very carefully at the front of his white sailor blouse. "I must go in properly," he said. "You look very fine already," Kitty told him. Teddy tried very hard not to look pleased. The dining room at Lavinia's manor glowed with lamplight and polished silver. It was not a large formal dinner, Aunt Lavinia had made that quite clear, but the table was nevertheless beautifully laid, the crystal catching the light in soft, steady glints. Outside, the last of the pale April evening pressed gently against the tall windows. Everyone was already assembled when Teddy entered with Kitty. His father stood near the hearth in quiet conversation with the Earl of Kilmartin. Jonathan and Viscount Lawrence were discussing something earnest and financial sounding near the sideboard. Andrew and the twins, Eloise and Edmund, shared some private amusement which made them look maddeningly alike. Aunt Lavinia, of course, was perfectly composed at the head of the table. Her eyes found Teddy at once. "There is our young gentleman." Teddy went forward dutifully. He was seated, very properly arranged, halfway down the table next to Clara and Andrew and opposite Kitty, which Teddy privately felt was both fortunate and unfortunate at the same time. Teddy sat very straight in his chair, scarcely daring to lean back, his napkin folded carefully across his knees. Clara gave his hand a small squeeze under the table. "You look extremely smart, Teddy." "Thank you, Clara," he said, sitting even straighter. Across the table, Kitty caught his eye for just a moment and gave the smallest approving nod. Dinner began smoothly. Soup, clear consommé or potted shrimps with toast. Teddy, after brief and serious consideration, chose the consommé. It seemed the more gentlemanly option. He managed the spoon very neatly, though he remained keenly aware of Aunt Lavinia's occasional soft glances in his direction. Across the table, Kitty caught Pip's name being mentioned by Edmund and gave Teddy the faintest conspiratorial look. The conversation flowed mostly among the elders: London news, the mildness of spring, the tiresome state of railway timetables, the season in London, and, more than once, the upcoming voyage. The Earl said, with mild satisfaction, and in a week's time we shall all be aboard the Titanic." Teddy's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He saw Aunt Lavinia's eyes flick, not to the Earl, but to Kitty across the table. It was only a second, but Teddy noticed. Teddy sat very straight. "Fish, poached plaice with parsley sauce or baked cod with butter and lemon." Andrew chose the cod with great confidence. Teddy followed suit. "The Titanic is said to be quite without equal," the Earl remarked. Papa inclined his head. "So I understand." "So," said Jonathan to Viscount Lawrence, "you've seen the latest figures on her size?" "Extraordinary," Lawrence replied. "Quite unsinkable, they say." At that, Aunt Lavinia gave a soft, almost amused breath. "People are so fond of absolutes," she said lightly. Her eyes moved again, to Kitty. Kitty, meanwhile, was carefully flaking her fish and appeared not to notice at all. Teddy's small shoulders drew in just a fraction. "Remove, roast chicken with bread stuffing, buttered new potatoes, carrots and peas." By the time the roast chicken was being served, Teddy had begun to feel the unmistakable approach of a very long moment. It was not that the chicken was disagreeable, on the contrary, it was perfectly nice chicken. It was simply that the grown-ups had entered what Teddy privately classified as extended serious conversation. "The Southampton timetable is quite fixed now," Papa was saying. "Yes, but the Liverpool connection," Jonathan began. Teddy cut his chicken very carefully into equal pieces. He listened, for nearly 12 whole seconds, then his eyes drifted. The lamplight made small golden shapes in the polished silver. The carrots and peas sat in very orderly arrangements. Someone, probably Clara, had folded her napkin into a most interesting triangle. Teddy shifted one shoe very slightly under the table. No one noticed. He took a small bite, chewed. "Listen again." "Unsinkable, of course," the Earl was saying comfortably. Teddy's attention wavered like a candle in a draught. He began, very secretly, to arrange his peas into what he felt was an extremely accurate defensive formation. One must keep occupied in long campaigns. From beside him came the softest whisper, "Teddy, Clara." He froze instantly. "Yes, Clara?" he murmured, sitting up very straight. Her eyes were warm but knowing. "Don't forget your vegetables, darling." "Yes, Clara." He immediately consumed 3 peas with great dignity. Clara spoke gently beside him. "You've been very quiet tonight." "I am listening," Teddy said earnestly. Andrew, next to him, gave him an approving grin. "Good man," but Teddy was only half listening, because twice now, he had seen Aunt Lavinia send that same smooth, watchful look toward Kitty, not unkind, but not warm either, something else, something Teddy could not quite name. Teddy resumed his chicken with renewed seriousness. Still, it was, he felt, a very long remove indeed. The conversation flowed steadily on above Teddy's head. Crossing time should be quite comfortable in April, provided the weather holds. White Star I've been most confident. Teddy chewed his chicken with careful determination. But his attention was drifting again, very quietly, so quietly that even Clara would not notice. He let the toe of his polished shoe move forward beneath the tablecloth. Just a little, just enough to brush the empty space where, earlier on the terrace, Pip had sat squarely on his foot as though it belonged there. Teddy stilled. For a moment, if he tried very hard, he could almost feel the warm, solid weight of him again. His tail had thumped twice against his ankle. He remembered exactly. A small, private comfort unfolded in his chest. He pressed his heel lightly into the carpet, the ghost of Pip's presence steadying him in the sea of grown-up voices and clinking silver. Across the table, Kitty lifted her glass. For just a second, only a second, her eyes met his, and something in her expression said she knew. Teddy sat a little straighter. The remove seemed much less long after that. Cold dish, sideboard cold ham or tongue, the older gentleman partook. Teddy declined with quiet dignity. Sweet, apple tart with custard or trifle. This, naturally, improved the evening considerably. "I think the apple tart, if you please," Kitty said. Teddy's head lifted at once. "I shall have the apple tart as well," he said quickly, then flushed faintly. Kitty's eyes warmed. "Well chosen, Mr. Florent." From the end of the table came the faintest pause in Aunt Lavinia's spoon. Again, that look, quick, measuring. Teddy's stomach gave a small, uncertain turn. Cheese, cheddar or Stilton, biscuits and celery. Teddy accepted a very small piece of cheddar in what he believed was an impressively mature manner. By now the room had softened into comfortable after-dinner warmth. The elders spoke of Southampton arrangements, travel trunks, departure times. Teddy sat very straight and very quiet. Across the table, Kitty was absent-mindedly sketching something in condensation on her water glass, the outline, Teddy noticed with quiet certainty, of a small dog with very large ears. Pip! Teddy felt something small and hopeful uncurl in his chest. Aunt Lavinia's perfume lingered sweet and heavy in the warm lamplight. "Well, my darling," Aunt Lavinia said smoothly behind him, "it is quite time young gentlemen were in bed." The moment broke like a pricked soap bubble. The nursery was dim and warm when Teddy was finally tucked beneath the covers. Aunt Lavinia herself drew the blankets neatly to his shoulders, her movements slow and careful. "There we are," she murmured. Her hand smoothed his hair. The sweet, heavy scent followed her even here. "You were very well behaved tonight." "Thank you, Aunt Lavinia," Teddy said softly. She bent and pressed a light kiss to his forehead. "Sleep sweetly, darling." The lamp was lowered, the door closed. In the quiet, Teddy lay very still. The day moved back through his mind in soft pieces, the garden, the kisses sent up to Mama, Pip's bright, happy face, Aunt Lavinia's watchful looks, the word Titanic floating again and again through the grown-ups' voices, Kitty's glass, and the small secret dog drawn there. His fingers curled slightly into the blankets. Something was changing, he could feel it, he did not know what. Outside, the English night settled gently over the manor, and at last, still thinking of ships and dogs and distant oceans, Teddy Florent drifted into sleep. Part 3, Keep elbows off the table. Sterling House, Tuesday, April 2, 1912. The house was already in motion when Teddy finally woke. Sunlight slipped through the nursery curtains in thin, polite stripes, and somewhere downstairs a door closed with purposeful energy. Voices drifted faintly through the corridor, adult voices, busy voices, the sort that meant important arrangements were underway. Teddy blinked sleepily at the ceiling. For a moment he could not remember where he was. Then, the garden, Pip, dinner, the word Titanic floating everywhere. He sat up. The clock on the mantel read 9. Teddy scrambled out of bed at once. By the time he was properly washed and brushed and guided downstairs, the breakfast room was nearly empty. A single place had been laid for him near the window. Teddy paused in the doorway. It felt different. Usually there was someone, Clara, or Andrew, or Papa with his newspaper, but this morning the room held only quiet sunshine and the faint clink of dishes being cleared somewhere far off. He climbed into his chair. Breakfast, however, was extremely respectable. Soft-boiled eggs in their cups, buttered toast in a silver rack, marmalade glowing like amber, a small dish of stewed apples and a proper cup of milk. Teddy approved at once. He began with the egg, tapping the top very carefully with his spoon. Crack! For a moment, just a moment, the top of the egg gave way, and in Teddy's mind the shell became the dome of a distant white city rising from the sands of some unexplored shore. He narrowed his eyes. Yes, very likely the inhabitants were friendly, but one could never be certain. He removed the cap of shell with great precision, an explorer making first landing, and dipped his toast soldier bravely into the golden depths. Victory! He ate thoughtfully after that. Still, it was rather quiet. By late morning the front drive was alive with trunks, valises, and purposeful footmen. The Kilmartins were departing for Alderwick Court. Teddy stood beside Clara on the steps, hands properly behind his back as he had been shown. The Earl shook Papa's hand warmly. "We shall expect you all the day after tomorrow, without fail," Papa replied. The Countess kissed Clara's cheek. The twins were already halfway into the motorcar, arguing amiably about something Teddy could not quite hear. Viscount Lawrence bowed politely to everyone in turn. And then, Kitty, she came last, Pip at her heels. "Well, Mr. Florent," she said softly, "you must take very great care of yourself until we meet again." "I shall," Teddy said earnestly. Pip wagged furiously. Teddy crouched, just briefly, and gave the dog a quick, secret scratch behind the ear. "Good boy," he whispered. Kitty's eyes warmed. Then Aunt Lavinia's voice floated smoothly across the gravel. "Kitty, my dear, you will miss your seat." Kitty straightened at once. "Yes, Aunt Lavinia," but Teddy did not miss the look Lavinia sent her. Smooth, cool, measuring, the motorcar pulled away in a slow cloud of pale dust. The terrace felt larger when it was gone. Later that afternoon the dining room was very quiet. Too quiet. Teddy sat in his chair, very straight, while Aunt Lavinia stood beside him like a particularly elegant schoolmistress. "Now, darling," she said pleasantly, "Alderwick Court is not quite like here, you will be dining rather more officially." Teddy's stomach gave a small but determined flutter. Lavinia continued, counting lightly on her fingers. Basic rules he was to follow: behavior, speak only when spoken to, speak softly and politely, sit up straight, keep elbows off the table, no fiddling with cutlery or napkin, dining, begin only when the hostess begins, taste everything, eat calmly and without noise, ask for things using, please and thank you. Teddy listened with grave intensity. I shall remember, he said. Lavinia's smile was very sweet. I know you will. Her fingers briefly adjusted the line of his collar. The perfume was very strong this close. The dining room remained very still. Teddy sat perched on the edge of his chair, back straight as a ramrod, hands placed carefully in his lap exactly as Aunt Lavinia had directed. His brow was faintly furrowed with the effort of remembering every single rule at once. Aunt Lavinia was saying smoothly, "And remember, darling, elbows are never, under any circumstance." There came a light tap at the doorframe. "Well now," said a familiar voice. "Andrew." Teddy's head turned at once. Andrew leaned casually against the doorway, tall and easy in the morning light, his expression already beginning to curve into a grin. "What's all this?" he asked. "Military drill?" Teddy brightened immediately. "Aunt Lavinia is teaching me the rules for Alderwood Court." "Is she indeed?" Andrew pushed himself off the doorframe and strolled into the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life worried about which fork to use. Aunt Lavinia's smile remained perfectly in place. "I am ensuring your brother does not disgrace us at the Kilmartins' table." Andrew placed a hand solemnly over his heart. "A noble cause." Teddy looked between them, slightly anxious. "I am trying very hard," he said. Andrew's expression softened at once. "I can see that, Ted." He came to stand beside Teddy's chair and, with great seriousness, inspected his posture. Andrew said. Teddy stiffened another inch. Andrew leaned down slightly and murmured, "Just for Teddy, you're doing better than I did my first time." I dropped an entire asparagus spear into the Countess of Harbury's lap. Teddy's eyes went enormous. "You did not." "I absolutely did." From across the table came the faintest, most controlled pause in Aunt Lavinia's teacup. Andrew straightened again, grinning openly now. "Tell you what," he said, "there is one very important rule Aunt Lavinia has not mentioned." Lavinia's eyes flicked toward him. "Oh?" Andrew winked at Teddy. "If you're ever in doubt," he lowered his voice conspiratorially, "just do exactly what Clara does. She's never wrong." Clara, who had just appeared quietly in the doorway, laughed softly. "Andrew," Teddy looked deeply relieved. "I can do that," he said. Andrew gave his shoulder a quick, warm squeeze. "You'll be splendid, Teddy. Just don't salute the soup." Teddy regarded Andrew with eyes full of admiration. Teddy gave a very serious nod. "I shall not." Aunt Lavinia's smile remained perfectly composed, but her eyes, just briefly, rested on Andrew. Later, alone again for a moment, Teddy sat very still in the great dining chair. Alderwood Court, an official dinner, so many rules. He straightened his back another fraction. He would do it properly. He must, because the world, Teddy was beginning to understand, was becoming very large indeed, and he meant, with the utmost determination, to be ready for it. Part 4, London Day. Wednesday, April 3, 1912. The platform at Leicester was alive with morning purpose. Steam drifted in soft white clouds beneath the iron canopy, porters moved briskly with trunks and hat boxes, and the 8:15 a.m. train to London waited in polished confidence along the platform edge. Teddy stood between Clara and Aunt Lavinia, gloved hands folded properly in front of him, trying not to stare at everything at once. He liked trains very much. They felt like beginnings. Their compartment was private, a sliding door of dark polish would shut them neatly away from the bustle of the corridor, and once inside, the world became smaller, and far more luxurious. The seats were upholstered in deep green velvet, buttoned and plush, with just enough give to feel indulgent without being improper. The brass fittings gleamed warmly in the morning light. Above the windows, small, netted racks held Lavinia and Claire's elegant small travelling cases. A cut glass water flask rested in its silver holder. Even the air felt refined, faintly scented with coal smoke and polished wood. Teddy climbed carefully onto his seat, boots placed together, and ran his gloved hand discreetly along the velvet beside him. It was very soft. The whistle blew. With a gentle lurch and a dignified sigh of steam, the train began to move. Fields slipped past the window in long green ribbons. Farmhouses drifted by. The sky was pale and clean. Teddy pressed closer to the glass. In his mind, the train was not traveling to London. It was racing across a continent, perhaps toward Constantinople. Or even further. He narrowed his eyes slightly. Yes! There might be diplomatic negotiations upon arrival. We have quite a full day, Aunt Lavinia said smoothly, removing her gloves with unhurried precision. Clara smiled at Teddy. First, Gammarelli and Company. Teddy turned at once. For my suit? For your Eton suit, Lavinia corrected gently, and a new sailor suit. You are quite outgrowing the present one. Teddy sat up straighter. An Eton suit sounded extremely serious. And after that? He asked. The photographer, Clara said. Your father insists upon a proper portrait before we sail. Teddy considered this gravely. He hoped the photographer would not insist on smiling. And then Harrod's, Clara continued. At this, Teddy's eyes widened slightly. Even he had heard of Harrod's. And tea at the Ritz, Lavinia finished. Her tone made it sound like a perfectly ordinary occurrence. Teddy tried very hard to behave as though tea at the Ritz happened to him all the time. The countryside blurred past faster now. The rhythm of the train settled into something steady and hypnotic. For a moment, Teddy imagined the wheels were not touching rails at all, but gliding across the surface of an endless ocean. He wondered what it would feel like when the Titanic moved beneath his feet. Would it feel like this? 10:25 a.m. London did not so much arrive as assemble itself. First came the factories, smoking industriously against the pale sky, then long terraces of brick houses pressing shoulder to shoulder, then iron bridges, layered with soot and authority, and finally the vast red brick Gothic facade of St. Pancras rising like something from a fairy tale of industry and empire. The train slowed beneath the vast iron vault of the station roof, a cathedral of glass and riveted steel. Steam billowed upward and caught the light, turning briefly to silver mist before dissolving into the rafters. Teddy stepped down onto the platform and stopped at once. The roof arched high above him like the ribcage of some enormous mechanical whale. He tilted his head back. If it breathed, he would not have been surprised. He rather approved of it. Porters hurried past with trunks, ladies adjusted hats, the air smelled of coal smoke, hot metal, damp wool, and importance, and then, Madam, a familiar voice, Aunt Lavinia's maid, Miss Harper, appeared from the flow of passengers as though London itself had produced her. She had travelled third class and wore a practical dark coat, her expression composed but brisk from the journey. She dropped a neat curtsy. I trust you had a comfortable passage, ma'am. Perfectly adequate, Lavinia replied smoothly. Miss Harper gathered the travelling cases at once, efficient and unflustered. Teddy noticed, not for the first time, how differently the grown-ups occupied space. Lavinia glided. Miss Harper moved with purpose. The distinction felt important, though Teddy could not have explained why. Shall we? Lavinia said lightly. They proceeded toward the station exit. Outside, London struck at once. Noise, wheels, hoos, shouting, whistles, and 1,000 moving directions at once. Cabs waited in a loose but determined formation along the curb. Aunt Lavinia selected one with the air of a general choosing a suitable mount. It was a handsome cab, neat, polished, and drawn by a tall bay horse with a dark, intelligent eye. Teddy forgot entirely about dignity. He stared. The horse stood proud and alert, harness gleaming, breath rising in small white puffs in the cool air. Its ears flicked forward and back, attentive to everything. Teddy approached cautiously as Miss Harper secured the cases. May I? He began. The driver, perched high at the rear, glanced down with a tolerant half-smile. He's steady, young sir. Teddy reached out and laid his gloved hand very gently against the horse's shoulder. Warm. Solid. Alive with restrained power. The horse shifted slightly, and Teddy felt the movement through his fingertips like it contained storm. He's magnificent, Teddy whispered. The driver's chest swelled. Best in the line, he is. Aunt Lavinia cleared her throat delicately. Teddy, yes, Aunt. He climbed into the cab between Lavinia and Clara, still glancing back at the horse as though leaving a new friend behind. The driver snapped the reins lightly. The cab surged forward. The motion was different from the train, sharper, more alive. The wheels rattled briskly over cobblestones, and London unfolded around them in layers of movement and colour. Omnibuses lumbered past, bright with painted advertisements. Gentlemen in bowler hats crossed confidently through traffic as though immune to danger. Street vendors called out their wares. Policemen stood solid and immovable at crossings like guardians of order. Teddy leaned toward the small front opening of the cab. The horse's back moved in steady rhythm. The harness creaked softly. Hooves struck the street with measured certainty. Clip, clop, clip, clop. He imagined they were not traveling to a tailor at all. They were racing through Cairo. Or perhaps Vienna. Or even some unnamed capital where ambassadors waited in tall marble halls. A motorcar roared past suddenly, startling him. The horse did not flinch. Teddy felt immediate admiration. "He is very brave," he murmured. "London requires it," Clara said kindly. Aunt Lavinia adjusted her gloves. "You must learn to move through cities as confidently as that horse, Teddy." He considered this. "Move steadily, do not shy, do not bolt." He nodded solemnly. "I shall try." The cab turned onto a broader avenue where grand shopfronts gleamed in the late morning light. Gammarelli and company awaited, and London, in all its vast and restless elegance, seemed to pulse around them like the beginning of something far larger than Teddy yet understood. The shop door closed behind them with a discreet, cushioned click. Inside, the world softened. Thick carpets muted footsteps, dark wooden cabinets lined the walls, filled with folded fabrics in sober navy, charcoal, and cream. A faint scent of wool, starch, and pressing irons lingered in the air. A gentleman with silvered hair emerged from behind a polished counter. "Lady Lavinia," he said with a small bow. "A pleasure, for my nephew," Lavinia replied, resting one gloved hand lightly at Teddy's shoulder. "He requires an Eton suit, properly cut, and a new sailor suit. Nothing ostentatious." The tailor's eyes assessed Teddy in one swift, professional sweep. "Of course!" Teddy was guided onto a small, raised platform before a tall mirror. "Stand naturally, if you please." Teddy stood extremely unnaturally. "Chin up, dear," Clara said gently. He lifted his chin. Clara hid a smile. "Relax a little, Teddy." He attempted to look both relaxed and impressive. Measurements were murmured, chalk brushed lightly against dark fabric, pins flashed. "This cut will give him presence," the tailor said thoughtfully. "He must look the part," Lavinia replied. "And what part is that?" Clara asked lightly. Lavinia's smile curved. "Why, the part he is destined for." Teddy did not entirely understand, but he lifted his chin another fraction. When the dark Eton jacket was briefly settled across his shoulders for measurement, something shifted inside him. It was heavier than his sailor suit, more serious. He imagined walking the deck of a grand liner not as a boy playing at adventure, but as someone expected to behave correctly within it. The sensation was both thrilling and faintly alarming. The Eton suit fabric was dark and serious, the new sailor suit crisp and bright. Aunt Lavinia watched closely. "Smart, but not ostentatious," she instructed. Teddy did not know what ostentatious meant, but he resolved not to be it. The photographer's studio was hushed and dim, heavy curtains blocked the outside world, backdrops of painted columns and distant landscapes waited patiently behind the camera. The photographer adjusted his spectacles. "Stand there, young sir, hands folded, eyes steady." Teddy stood. "Do not smile too broadly," the photographer advised. "Dignity is preferable." Teddy considered this gravely. He thought of Papa. Of Andrew. Of how Andrew tried not to laugh at things he found amusing. He imagined himself a naval cadet awaiting orders. He composed his face. Behind the camera's black cloth, the photographer disappeared like a magician entering another realm. There was a pause, a stillness. For one suspended second, Teddy felt as though time itself were holding its breath. The flash burst, bright and sudden. When the light faded, Teddy blinked. He wondered, quite seriously, whether that moment would now exist forever somewhere, captured and unmoving, even as everything else continued forward. It felt important. Harrods was not merely a shop, it was an empire under glass. Light poured through vast windows and glittered across counters of silverware, rows of leather trunks, towers of books, and toys imported from countries Teddy had only read about. Clara allowed him to walk beside her rather than strictly behind. He paused before a display of miniature ships. One in particular, Whitehall, 4 funnels, caught his eye. He leaned closer. Its name was not Titanic. But it might have been. "You like ships," Clara observed gently. "Yes," Teddy said. "Do you wish to sail one?" He considered. "I think. I wish to understand them." Clara studied him a moment longer than usual. Elsewhere, Lavinia examined gloves with exacting precision. Nothing escaped her. While Teddy studied a globe, tracing the Atlantic with one thoughtful finger, Lavinia and Clara stood a little apart. "You are very intent upon preparing him," Clara said quietly. "It is necessary," Lavinia replied. "The world is not forgiving to those who are unformed." "He is 11, precisely." Clara's gaze drifted toward Teddy. "He is also kind." Lavinia adjusted a glove seam. "Kindness is agreeable," she said smoothly, "but composure endures." Clara did not immediately answer. In the distance, Teddy's finger reached the far side of the ocean. The Ritz glowed in white and gold. Mirrors multiplied chandeliers into infinity, Porcelain cups rested on saucers so thin they seemed almost translucent. Teddy sat very straight, he remembered every rule. Speak only when spoken to. Sit upright, elbows away. Milk or lemon? Clara asked gently. Milk, please, he said. Thank you, Aunt Lavinia observed with quiet satisfaction. You see? She murmured, quite capable. Small sandwiches disappeared neatly, cakes were sampled with careful bites. Teddy felt both tired and expanded, as though the city had opened something inside him. Outside, London moved ceaselessly. Inside, he practiced stillness. Evening train, 5:45 p.m. The return compartment felt softer now, the velvet embraced him like reward. As the train moved northward into gathering twilight, Teddy leaned his head lightly against the glass. The reflection that stared back at him looked slightly older than the boy who had left that morning. Not much, but enough. Fields slid past in blue-gray hush. Clara rested her gloved hand over his. You have done very well today. Teddy nodded. He was thinking of the photograph, of the suit, of the globe, of the miniature ship, and somewhere, far beyond the rails and the fields and the English evening, the great ocean waited.